Originally, we were going to include this as part of our Man-Eaters of History series, but thought that might be a tad insensitive, so instead we went with this. It's like a dinner reservation. Anyway, the Donner Party. We're going back to spring 1846, May 12th more specifically, where a train of nearly 500 wagons left Independence, Missouri, beginning their trek westward along the Oregon Trail. Yeah, we talked about that one before. Keep in mind, at this point, the Donner Party didn't exist, but most of the people that would end up making up the Donner Party were part of the wagon train. The train at that point was led by William Russell, but would eventually come under the leadership of Lilburn Boggs and was known as the Boggs Company. The Donner in Donner Party was George Donner, who was heading out west with his family. Another family that would join up with them was the Reed family, led by James Reed. The two groups had a total of 32 people, by the way. Within a week of leaving Independence, both families joined a group of about 50 wagons, and a few weeks later were joined by another family and a handful of men, as well as a German couple. They made decent time. Typically along the Oregon Trail, you could expect to travel about 15 miles a day, and though they were slowed down by rain and a flooded river, by June 16th they'd made it about 450 miles, or a little under 13 miles a day. On July 12th, Donner and Reed were given a letter by a writer who was sent by Lansford Hastings. The letter told of a new route to take, known as the Hastings Cutoff, that would cut about 350 miles off their journey. It claimed that if they joined him at Fort Bridger, Hastings himself would escort them along the way. And so on July 20th at the Little Sandy River, it was decided that most of the train would keep their course, but a small group would split off and try the new route. This small group elected George Donner as their leader, and they thus became the Donner Party. They headed for Fort Bridger, but they arrived a week after Hastings had already left with another party. They decided to carry on after resting for 4 days, and so on July 31st, they began their trip along the Hastings Cutoff, which proved to be more difficult than they had intended, and the going was very slow. It wasn't the easiest trail to traverse with wagons, let alone an easy trail to follow, as it wasn't well established and thusly not well defined. So getting lost was pretty easy, plus they still had to move boulders out of the way to pass through. Hastings had left instructions in letters attached to trees along the way, and on August 6th, they found one telling them to stop and wait for him to guide them along a different route that would avoid a canyon. Not knowing how long that would take, 3 men rode ahead and caught up with Hastings, who told them the general idea of what route to take, and they headed back. The group then had to decide whether they wanted to turn around to go the normal route, take the Hastings Cutoff even though it was clear that it would be difficult, or take this new but supposedly easier route. They chose the latter, but keeping in mind that they were literally blazing a trail, so that meant clearing brush, cutting down trees, moving boulders, slowing them down to only 1.5 miles a day. They were also joined at this point by the Graves family, who had caught up with them from the rest of the former train. This brought the grand total of the Donner Party to 87 people, 29 men, 15 women, and 43 children. By late August, they had made their way through the land and up a mountain, but from the top of that mountain they saw this, the Great Salt Lake Desert, an 80-mile trip through a dried lake bed that saw 100-degree temperatures during the day and got to near freezing at night. And even though there was no grass or water, the little moisture that did exist in the ground turned it into basically a slurry that made wagon travel rather difficult. In fact, they had to abandon quite a few of them after getting stuck. And they lost a good number of oxen, cattle, and horses who either died of dehydration or literally ran off crazed into the desert in search of water. After 6 days, they finally crossed the desert, then rested to recover what wagons and livestock they could. Another 40 miles of desert was ahead of them, but they crossed it relatively easily. And on September 26th, about 2 months after they had taken the cutoff, that was supposed to be quicker but ended up adding an extra month to their journey, they finally rejoined the normal trail. They broke into 2 groups to travel faster and began to come across natives who for the most part either stole or killed their livestock. But after one more desert, they finally finally came to fresh water and lush vegetation on the Truckee River, and had only one final push over the mountains to go. And so, on October 20th, they began heading up the mountain. However, they ran into earlier than expected snowfall and were forced to camp near Truckee Lake, which by the way is now known as Donner Lake, with 60 people living amongst 3 cabins and a lean-to, while the rest were with the Donners at a camp about 5 miles away. Now, something important to add here, you'd figure that dealing with hardship and starvation would bring people together, but no, instead they were rather divided. Some families had more food than others, and rather than share, they sold it. Plus, these cabins were cabins in the sense that they had walls and somewhat of a roof. The roofs had to be patched with ox hide, and there were no doors or windows, only a single large opening. And a lot of the time, they were snowed into their cabins. So yeah, take a look at the picture here. Those are the trees that members of the party cut down. That's how high the snow was. Although they had lost most of their animals by this point, what they had left had starved to death and were eaten. And by eaten, I mean every part. The hides were cooked and eaten. The bones were used to make soup until they crumbled when chewed or roasted and eaten. The oxhide roof was eaten little by little, as was any oxhide that could be found. Life was pretty miserable, and it was decided that though small parties had failed to hike out, in order to get help, a larger group might just make it. So, on December 16th, a party of 17 men, women, and children set out to get help, a group that became known as the Forlorn Hope. Now, keep in mind, the snow was 12 feet or so deep, or high, or whatever, and though they took enough food for 6 days, they ran out of food. And after several days of no food, they began to discuss whether someone should volunteer to die so that the rest could eat them. It was decided that they would keep moving and would eat whoever died first. Soon, 4 men had died, and so their bodies were stripped of whatever was edible, but they did take care to make sure that no one ate anyone they were related to, but even that food only lasted for so long. They ran out of human to eat and began to discuss killing 2 natives that had joined the party before they had set up camp. The natives were warned and they ran away, but the party ended up running into them anyway, at which point they were killed and eaten. By that point, the group had been traveling for 25 days. Several days later, the 7-ish remaining Forlorn Hopers stumbled, starving and half crazed, into a native village, and they looked so frightening that the villagers ran away when they first saw them. The village didn't have much in terms of food, mostly nuts and acorns, which are delicious, and after a few days of rest, one of the group, William Eddy, traveled with some natives to a settlement and brought back a rescue party that arrived on January 17th, or 33 days after the Forlorn Hope had left the cabins at Truckee Lake. The problem was they still had all those folks back at the cabins and the Donner camp, and there was a lack of people to go rescue them. See, this was California during the Mexican-American War, so pretty much every able-bodied man was off fighting. Luckily, they were still able to send several rescue parties over the next few months, and they rescued what survivors had wanted to leave. A few stayed behind and died, and some of the rescued people died along the journey from the cabins back to civilization. Of the 87 party members, 48 survived. Most of the rest were either eaten or at least eaten on, and many of the survivors dealt with being looked down on by society for cannibalism, but, I guess that was better than, starving to death.